was fascinating to me to write this book. And sort of on the one hand, I got this kind of true crime, archaeological theft story. And on the other hand, had this, evangelical Christian political story. But they really do kind of intersect in a lot of interesting ways and sort of inform each other, I think.
It's pretty well known at this point that the multi-billion-dollar arts and crafts corporation Hobby Lobby is steeped in evangelical Christianity, a company owned by a family that is extremely influential in conservative American politics. Our guest today is investigative journalist Michael Blanding, author of the brand new book, The Gospel According to Hobby Lobby, Inside a Billionaire Family's Quest to Craft a Christian Nation. For this episode, Michael tells me about the spiritual history of the family behind Hobby Lobby, their Indiana-Jonesian scandals involving stolen religious relics, the contents of their propagandic Bible museum, and the right-wing groups and causes they have funneled their riches into. Together, we discuss the contradictions of their alleged Christian kindness to individuals and the larger project of funding the rise of Christian nationalism to show how the crafty psychology of these true believers allows them to do what they want while truly believing they are holy instruments for the one Almighty God. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am so excited for this one, you guys. This is going to be a really interesting ride, I think, and one that I bet a lot of you have been wondering about, but maybe not getting the full story. So, Michael, thank you for being here and bringing this to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to talk about it.
Great. Well, you are someone who have kind of written a tome about Hobby Lobby and the kind of evangelical basis of so much of what they are doing behind the scenes. I think that you actually called them, or you said no family has done more for Christian nationalism, which of course was quite intriguing. And I knew a little bit about that, but we're going to get into all that today. And I think that I would love if you would explain to us why Hobby Lobby, Michael. Why did you decide to spend what you told me was about 4 years on this topic? What drew you here?
I started working on the book in 2022, and I can't believe that I've been working on it this long, but there's just been so much to delve into and, so many threads to pull as I've been writing that I wanted to pull them all. And, in terms of why Hobby Lobby, I mean, you're exactly right. They are this family that has had this incredible influence on our culture and our politics, and yet very few people know about them. And, obviously people know about the craft store. You see these big box craft stores everywhere, and people might have heard about the abortion or the birth control case, rather, where Hobby Lobby was involved in 2014. But they have been consistently using their wealth and influence to push America into this realm of Christian nationalism and living according to these, quote unquote, biblical principles in a way that was really astonishing to me as I was reporting the book and will hopefully be surprising to readers as well.
Oh, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of surprises. And, I think I've been in a Hobby Lobby maybe like once or twice in my life. Mm-hmm. Of course, I tend to go over to Joanne's and her, what I like to say, gay best friend, Michael's. And, right. I think that's always been more my speed. But I think I've just always kind of known that there is like this specter living inside of Hobby Lobby that always freaked me out. And I didn't really want to support them. So I guess we'll find out how right I and so many other people were today. So, Michael, this is quite a story. There are a lot of places I think we could start. Where do you like to start when you explain this to people?
Well, let me start where I started and what first got me interested in the project in the first place, which was an article in the New York Times about a rare cuneiform tablet called the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet.
Wild.
And it was being seized from this museum in Washington, D.C. called the Museum of the Bible. And it turned out that this tablet had been bought for $1.7 million. And it had been determined that it was illegally looted from Iraq and put into this museum. And about halfway through the story, it said that the owners of this tablet were the Hobby Lobby Corporation and the Green family, the family of David Green and his sons, Steve Green and Mark Green, were the owners of this thing. And immediately as a journalist, I just kind of did a double take and said, what is this big box craft store brand doing with this ancient stone tablet, clay tablet? And that sort of sent me down the rabbit hole and made me realize that, this was sort of part of a larger agenda that they had to kind of prove the truth and reliability of the Bible and further its influence across the country.
It is such an American, like a quintessentially American thing to hear about. I feel like it's very wild. And so maybe in that vein, let's go back to the beginning of this family's interest maybe in the evangelical mission.
Yeah. So, I didn't know a whole lot about evangelicalism before I started my research 4 years ago. I came to know quite a bit about it. But the Greens come from this very conservative church, which is more in the realm of Pentecostalism, which overlaps with evangelicalism. And right around the turn of the 20th century, there was this huge upwelling of spirituality that people were speaking in tongues and they were having visions and they were, dancing and seeing God and hearing, messages from God, and became this very kind of insular sect of Christian believers that came to be known as Pentecostalism. And within that, there was one church in particular called the Church of God of Prophecy that the Green family was subscribed to.
Sounds scary.
Yeah, they are particular in their beliefs that this is the one and only way to be saved, and that Jesus is going to come back and he's going to separate the saved from the damned. And if you don't believe in the tenets of this church in particular, then you're not going to go to heaven. And so right from the beginning, it sort of sets up this real kind of like us versus them mentality that kind of echoes down through the later generations of the family, as I was defined.
Wow. Okay, so we have a family that sounds like they're in a cult at this point or something, more...
Something sort of adjacent, yeah.
Adjacent. A new religious movement, we'll say.
Right.
Politically correct cult. And
an extreme form of Christianity.
Yes, an extreme form of Christianity for sure. So what happened as they were getting more and more involved in this? Like, what is the next step in their journey toward becoming the Hobby Lobby empire? Yeah,
well, I wanted to tell the story of this family and this company, but I also wanted to tell the story of the kind of rise of evangelicalism in the 20th century and the rise of the Christian right.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that I didn't realize is that kind of a fundamentalist view of Christianity that really holds like the Bible is the ultimate truth and the Bible is historically reliable and it's the actual word of God, really only dates back about 120 years to the turn of the 20th century. But since then, it really picked up steam over the course of, the past 100 years or so, and really became this movement of believers that believe that the Bible is accurate. Before then, it was sort of seen as this kind of collection of stories. Some were true, some weren't, or that it should be interpreted sort of allegorically as kind of, man's relationship to God. But there was this real shift that occurred right around the 1910s, 1920s that sort of grew into the evangelical movement that we have today that really looks to the Bible as the ultimate source of authority, and then sort of retroactively sort of describes the United States as this nation that was founded on biblical principles and founded according to Christian beliefs. And that's what has given rise to this Christian nationalist movement that, we see everywhere now and is really influential in our society.
I have read about this, and it is really surprising how new so much of what feels to us like it would be ancient. Like fundamentalism presents itself so much as this like return almost to something that once was true, and we've like strayed from that. But really, it is just this rigid, strange way of reading a text like this, which I think for centuries and centuries has been interpreted as symbolism, at least in many of the stories. And so it is like, I always am interested in what that motivation was behind like the architects that were doing that. That might be something you may or may not know. Maybe we don't know. But I think I'm what I would like to know is if you have any insight into why the Green family in particular was attracted to this new movement.
It's interesting because there are, I think, a lot of reasons why fundamentalism arose, and, probably above my pay grade and beyond the scope of this conversation. But I think in some of the chaos of the Civil War and then later World War I, there was a real sort of yearning for order and a return to, principles that we could kind of look to underpin society. And, the Greens were, among, their family, the generations back, were converted to this religion. It was a very large emphasis placed on converting other people and saving other souls. And that's sort of something that, continues to resonate for the family, that it's just enough to do good in this life, but, there's another life coming after this. And not only do you want to live your life in order to achieve that, but you want to go out and rescue and save those around you. And so that's really how it began. David Green's grandfather was the first to convert to this church, the Church of God of Prophecy, and then his father became a minister. And then what was interesting is that, David Green's the sort of patriarch of the family. He's 84 now. But all of his brothers and sisters, he had 5 brothers and sisters, they were all pastors in the church. And he's sort of always felt like the black sheep of the family. And if you read some of his writings and some of his books, he always talks about sort of how he felt guilty, and particularly guilty towards his mother, who always turned to him and said, "David, what have you done for the Lord?" And so he had sort of grew up with this kind of chip on his shoulder, feeling like, he wasn't worthy because he hadn't, done more to save souls. And so when he did found Hobby Lobby, this company, that started in his garage putting together picture frames in the 1970s, it was with this idea right from the very beginning that this company would be sort of a vessel that he would use for religious purposes. And, you can sort of psychoanalyze it, as much as you want. There's definitely sort of a Freudian interpretation there of, sort of his, familial guilt sort of leading him into this. But, it's really made him into a true believer that wants to use the vast resources that selling glitter glue and popsicle sticks has given to him in order to, promulgate the Bible and save souls. And he's a true believer in that mission.
And I think that that's always a question that I have, because I think that my cynicism tends to push me toward, oh, this is a grift, oh, this is, they're using this version of religion in order to get donations or push business or whatever. But from what I have read of your book, it does seem like these are our true believers, like that this is a genuine mission, which I'm sure we can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, for sure.
But I would love to start with, how did Hobby Lobby start? You already mentioned it a little bit. Picture frames in the garage.
Yeah. So David Green, like I said, he was kind of the black sheep of the family. He didn't have the kind of outgoing nature and the charisma of his brothers and sisters. So he just wasn't suited to become a minister himself. But he sort of discovered in high school, he was part of this kind of work-study program. And he started working in this variety store in this little town in Oklahoma. And it turned out that that was well within his wheelhouse. And he was just really suited for working hard and designing decorative displays and selling goods. And, eventually he kind of worked his way up the ranks and launched his own company. They like to say they took out a $600 loan, he and his partners. They took a $600 loan and got this frame cutting machine that they put in the garage to cut picture frames that they were going to sell. And then a couple of years later, they opened up a retail store and added some arts and crafts, and we're kind of off to the races. And from there, what I learned about the company, and the book's not so much about the company, but what I learned is that selling arts and crafts is really a recession-proof business because, in the good times, you sell a lot. And then when people tighten their belts, they go and they make presents for people rather than going to the store and buying them. So whether the economy is doing good or bad, they were always making money. And it turned out to be a very lucrative business for them.
So it's like whenever times are hard, we continue to drink and we continue to go to the movies and to craft. Yes, I think that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah, like we all saw during COVID.
Yeah, I know. I'd love to see the stats on how many people took up a craft during COVID.
Totally.
I did not take up a craft. I did start bird watching, but other than that.
Okay. That's sort of like a craft.
Yeah, I was still making this show the whole time. I didn't have time for crafts.
Correct.
I would have liked to, but the business picked up. And then I am interested in when did the business go from, what it was, this kind of modest venture into becoming this kind of massive. I know that's probably a long story, but if you want to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it was kind of a slow and steady rise, to be honest. And there was one sort of crucial moment that I talk about in my book that David Green talks about in his own writings over and over again. In the 1980s, there was this big oil crash that took place in Oklahoma. There was this huge boom and Hobby Lobby was making money hand over fist. And then there was this crash. And that was the one time that the economy really affected the company. And it was the one year that they lost money. They lost like $1 million that year or something. And what's significant about it is that some business people might take that as a sign like, oh, we overextended ourselves, or we were selling the wrong things, or we need to, grow more slowly. The message that David Green took away from that was that God is punishing me. And I have been unworthy in the eyes of God. And from here until eternity, I am dedicating my business to the Lord. And that's sort of this critical turning point that happens. They got rid of all of their debt. And they prayed before making every decision, and they started tithing a certain amount of the company every year to go to these religious purposes. And so as the company kind of grew little by little and, expanded, over the course of decades into other states, and, first there were tens of stores, then hundreds of stores, and now there's, more than 1,000 stores. Along with that, they were also increasing these religious efforts and growing the kind of different religious causes that they were investing in, and eventually getting involved in politics as well. So it's a really fascinating story. It is a very American story of like picking yourself up from your bootstraps and working hard at the same time. It's got this added twist of, funneling all this money towards these evangelical Christian causes.
And, we hear about Catholic guilt, but I'm sensing some Protestant guilt here as well.
Sure.
Yeah, a very, very American story. More after this. And now back to the show. So what was their first actual venture into kind of this evangelical proselytizing? Like, was there an organization? How did they start actually entering that sphere?
They kind of started donating money through their church and different missionary efforts and things like that. But the sort of origin story of their larger kind of, public proselytizing was in 1994. David says that he was reading the newspaper on Christmas morning and flipping through the pages and getting more and more upset because he saw all these visions of Santa Claus and reindeer and snowmen, but he didn't see anything about Jesus. And from then on, he determined that he would put an ad in the newspaper next Christmas and he would start, publicly professing his faith. Now, I've actually gone back to that paper, the Daily Oklahoman from 1994, and there was a ton of Jesus in the paper. So I don't know what he was talking about. It's sort of like seeing what he wanted to see, or maybe sort of getting caught up in the, some of the zeitgeist of the evangelical, war on Christmas at the time. But that was really it. So the next year they put this ad in the paper that, a very small ad saying, Hobby Lobby, Jesus loves you and Hobby Lobby wants you to be saved. And then they started putting bigger and bigger advertisements and more papers, and then donating to all of these causes to kind of get the Bible around the world and translate the Bible, and then buying this real estate that they would donate to these Christian universities and other, these really hardline Christian organizations. And from there, it was just kind of off to the races. They were using their money just more and more for those causes.
So what was the first big thing that broke this out into the public eye, aside from these ads that I know people were seeing? But, what was that controversy that really launched this?
So for many years, the Greens were sort of working behind the scenes, and they were donating to all of these Christian causes. And like I say, buying all this Christian real estate. But it was really not until early 2010s that they became involved in this cause that eventually went to the Supreme Court. And it was when Obama came to office and passed the Healthcare Act. There was something in it that said that companies had to offer insurance that provided birth control to employees. And Hobby Lobby, along with a number of other Christian companies, sort of became up in arms about that and said, we're not going to do anything that's going to contribute to birth control, which they saw in some ways as just another form of abortion and killing babies. And so they decided to fight. And that's, I think, really when Hobby Lobby became a household name for this, for being a Christian company and became associated with evangelicals. This case, they went to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's pretty wild to have your name attached to a controversy like that. But
Yeah.
I assume that this ultimately was a positive thing for them. I assume there was negative PR. I assume there was positive PR on the more Christian side of things. How did this actually affect the company itself?
Yeah, I think it went both ways for them. There was a moment when they were really looking at financial consequences from this. They were going to have to pay these dramatic fines every day that they didn't provide birth control. And there was a moment where it looked like the company was in jeopardy. And to their credit, if you want to put it that way, they stayed true and they said, we're going to do this regardless of the consequences. And Daniel and the lion's den, and they persisted. And I think that for the people who were already supporters of Hobby Lobby and appreciated the fact that they were closed on Sundays and played Christian music in their stores, that they just doubled down on their support. And then there was a whole other group of people that I think really criticized Hobby Lobby, including a lot of Christians and religious people who didn't identify with evangelicalism and called them out for, not taking care of their employees. It's very polarizing, I think. And, I spoke with people, crafters and people who, have hobbies and go to crafting stores. And I think there's really a divide there that, this comes up all the time, that people either go to Hobby Lobby or they don't go to Hobby Lobby. And it hasn't seemed to affect their business very much. They still seem to have a loyal customer base, but it definitely splits both ways.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I think it would be fun, if this feels like the right moment, to get into some of their work, quote unquote, collecting Christian artifacts.
Yeah.
So where does that, we talked about it a little bit
Sure.
in the very beginning, but where does that story start? Because it kind of is this archaeological, almost like, what would I call it? Like Indiana-Jones-esque story.
Yes, very much so.
Which makes it even more American.
Yes.
Yeah. Where would you start with that story?
Yeah, so this actually predates the birth control case.
Okay.
It started around 2009. And like I said, they were sort of pushing this idea of the Bible as this kind of ultimate source of truth and goodness in the world. And they were doing that through a number of different ways. They were supporting missionary work. They were supporting Bible translations. They were, getting the Bible in the hands of more and more people. And around that time in the mid-2000s, they were approached by a group of people who were trying to create a museum of the Bible from a evangelical Christian perspective. So the Greens, jumped right on board this project and ended up sort of taking over the project. The original people sort of ended up fading from view and leaving the project as the Greens became more and more obsessed with it. And obsessed really is the right word. And this is not David Green. This is David Green's son, Steve Green, who's the president of Hobby Lobby. And this was his personal pet project. He wanted to create this museum. And of course, it would have these exhibits, showing, the history of the Bible and how the Bible has been, embedded in the history of America and all that. But a huge project, part of the project from the very beginning was to use these biblical artifacts as a way to kind of bolster the reliability of the Bible and to show that the stories that are in the Bible are historically accurate and true. And so Steve ended up, in a very short period of time, traveling all around the world. And he got involved with this quote unquote archaeologist by the name of Steve Carroll, who's a bit of a shady individual and sort of presented himself as this kind of modern day Indiana Jones and was gallivanting around the world to Turkey and Egypt and Israel and just basically vacuuming up thousands and thousands of these biblical historical artifacts that Hobby Lobby was purchasing. And what was, really fascinating about it is that Hobby Lobby made money on this because they could buy these artifacts pretty cheaply and then bring them back to the United States and get them appraised at a much higher value and then donate them to this nonprofit museum that they were starting. And they could take a tax break that in some cases would more than pay for the artifacts themselves. So it started, I don't think that was their main goal, but it sort of was almost this kind of, money laundering scheme that was, completely legal because it was just, basically based on the tax donations. But that's sort of where everything started.
Wow. There's always got to be a tax scheme, isn't there? No matter what the topic is.
Yeah.
So, okay. I imagine that some of these artifacts were genuine. I don't know what makes a biblical artifact genuine necessarily, but maybe not a forgery of a piece of history, right?
Yes.
So what would you say is like a legitimate artifact that they had that like gives some evidentiary support to the idea that the Bible has at least some true stuff in it?
There are really two main artifacts. There are a lot of different artifacts, but there are two kind of main categories. One were these cuneiform tablets, and they date from Iraq and Syria and go back, literally thousands of years to, the earliest days of the Old Testament.
Okay.
So they were, buying these by the thousands. And, ironically, most of them had nothing to do with the Bible. They were, records of like grain, trading among, merchants or things like that. But they didn't know that. They were just, trying to sort of prove that, these biblical, writings existed back, dating back to the time the Bible was written. The other one was these papyrus fragments, and those mainly come from Egypt and other places in the Middle East, but mainly from Egypt. And they're more associated with the New Testament period, and they were really looking for them to sort of bolster the facts of the life of Jesus in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And many of the papyrus fragments that the museum acquired were biblical in nature. And they were from including some early books of the Bible. And one of the things they were really focused on was to try to get back as close as they could to the original writing of the New Testament, to sort of show that it remained unchanged and that it was, as close to the life of Jesus as possible. And so those were the two main things, these cuneiform tablets and these papyrus fragments. And they were totally legitimate. They weren't forged or anything like that. But the problem was that they were almost all stolen and looted from countries that they should not have been taking them and selling them from. And we could talk a little bit more about how that was discovered, but that became the major scandal.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to talk about that. I do think it's so kind of funny that their proof of kind of the early days of the Old Testament was just like, they had grain. See, they had grain.
Right. Totally.
It's right there in the Bible. They had grain.
I know. But like maybe there was some name or something in one cuneiform tablet that, was in the book of, Ezekiel or something, and they could point to. I mean, that was kind of their project, but didn't end up bearing much fruit.
Definitely. It reminds me a little bit. I mean, this is a much less sophisticated version of the story, but we recently did an episode about the history of our relationship to dinosaurs. And part of that was how fundamentalism and museums, we've been talking about, used dinosaur footprints that were slightly like the way that they imprinted into the mud or whatever it was that turned to stone did kind of look like human footprints. So they built kind of this whole world just around that evidence. And that's obviously a total hoax. This has more reality behind it. But I do just think it is like they're reaching for that scientific quote unquote evidence, which I think is just so interesting because it feels like that just must have evolved along with our conception of science being important and, religion wanting to keep up with those changes. So they're like, I guess we have to find this evidence that what we believe is real.
Yeah. And just as a side note, the Greens were a huge supporter of this other museum called the Creation Museum that maybe you've come across, and by this guy named Ken Ham, who I just love. Oh,
Ken Ham, I know him.
Who believed that dinosaurs existed in the days of Adam and Eve, and if you go to the Creation Museum, there's Adam and Eve and dinosaurs all happily cavorting together. And the Greens were big supporters of him. They gave him a lot of money. They actually had an early exhibit of the Museum of the Bible in the Creation Museum. Steve Green talks in his books about how, creationism is real. So that's all part of this same project, proving the timeline of the Bible, is as it says it is. It's just their museum. They were sort of aiming to at least present themselves as more sophisticated and more in line with biblical scholarship, sort of more mainstream biblical scholarship. So you won't see any dinosaurs in the Museum of the Bible, but there's certainly some DNA that they share.
That's cool. It had to be there, right?
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we get into maybe some of this forgery stuff that ended up being a big problem for them?
Yeah. Well, this is where it becomes a little bit complicated because, like I say, the Green family, they're true believers, and they, for the most part, they're not hypocrites. They're not doing this just to make money or anything. Mm-hmm. But for a family that presents itself as these kind of paragons of biblical truth, they certainly didn't adhere very well to the commandment of thou shalt not steal. And in acquiring all of these artifacts, I was able to go back and I had some documents leaked to me that sort of showed the documents that they were relying on when they bought these things. And the provenance that was ascribed to these things was just really sketchy. And anybody who was in the field of biblical scholarship or archaeology, it was pretty clear that this stuff was being looted illicitly from Egypt and Iraq, in the wake of Arab Spring and the wake of the Iraq War. And, they just turned a blind eye to it. And I think they sort of said, well, there's a larger purpose here. This is God directing us to do this. And we're just instruments of his means. And, whatever we have to do is okay. But there really is some, if not hypocrisy, there's some real ethical lapses there in the way that they acquired this stuff. And that's where I think it relates.
And really quick, so were these artifacts being looted from like museums or universities, or do you know the story behind how they were actually acquired, or is that just kind of in the shadows?
Yeah, so mostly they were being dug out of the ground by looters.
Okay.
I actually went, as part of my reporting for the book, went to Iraq and went to one of the sites where some of these cuneiform tablets came from, and you could see these big holes in the ground. They're just basically in the wake of the Iraq War. They're just not able to secure these archaeological sites, and these looters come in under the cover of darkness. They dig all this stuff up, and then, it goes through a series of middlemen. It might go from Iraq to Jordan to Israel to Turkey, and eventually, to London, and then, into the hands of people like the Greens. But it's this really fascinating sort of black market chain that, at each stage of the chain, there's, people profiting from it, and there's attempts to sort of obscure its origins. But there's some really amazing investigations that occurred with both biblical scholars and law enforcement that basically unearthed a lot of this stuff that I relied on for my book.
Wow. I love that you have like secret sources. That's so exciting.
It's always fun as a journalist, for sure.
Yeah, I bet.
Just as a side note, I was actually, I spoke to a former employee of the Museum of the Bible. I sort of went through, a chain of people talking to me, and I got to this one person, and they picked up the phone and they said, I've been waiting for this call. Yeah. It's like, I've been waiting to talk about this for years, ever since I left the museum. And that's, as a journalist, that's what you want to hear. And so absolutely. They gave me a lot of inside information about how this stuff, made its way into the Greens and the kind of ethical lapses that occurred. And it was fascinating to me to write this book. And sort of on the one hand, I got this kind of true crime, archaeological theft story. And on the other hand, had this, evangelical Christian political story, but they really do kind of intersect in a lot of interesting ways and sort of inform each other, I think.
I definitely want to get into that next. Is there anything else from this story before we move on that you think would be interesting to share, like what the fallout ended up being?
So the fallout didn't end up being very much for the Greens. They had to give all these artifacts back. They gave back around 40,000 artifacts.
Okay, that's good.
But they just got a slap on the wrist. They paid like $3 million. They got to keep all the tax breaks that they had acquired from it. And the Museum of the Bible still exists. And I think that's where this really dovetails with the larger influence that the family has had, is that you have this huge museum in Washington, D.C. that's 3 blocks from the Capitol building. And while it doesn't have these biblical artifacts anymore, it has all of these exhibits that really push this kind of Protestant, Christian, evangelical point of view about the Bible and about religion and about America. And it's kind of become almost this clubhouse for the Christian right, where all of these events are held there. And it's become this kind of base camp for, Mike Johnson holds his annual breakfast there. And, they have these, religious kind of ceremonies there, and anti-abortion groups use it. And so they kind of created this kind of headquarters for the Christian right in Washington, D.C. in this museum, whether or not it has these, cuneiform tablets in it anymore.
Wow. I'm just like imagining Mike Johnson's breakfast just being toast with nothing on it, just like hard, dry toast that they're all eating. Yeah.
In fact, you're not far off, because they called it a prayer breakfast, and people paid to go there, and then there was no breakfast. It was like 6 in the morning, and it was just prayer and no breakfast.
Okay, so that's more accurate.
Yeah. Exactly. So real hardliners.
Oh my God, that's so funny. Okay, so let's move into some of their political affiliations, their movement.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the fundamentalism, the Pentecostal roots, fundamentalism might as well be Christian nationalism at this point. But I'm interested in like the nationalism part as well. If we have, we've talked a little bit about their kind of obsession with the religion itself, but how does this pertain to the politics of America?
Yeah. So, they've used their money really strategically in a lot of ways. And the birth control case was sort of their kind of political coming out party. And, it was really the first case to prevail on these quote unquote religious freedom grounds. And it used this law. It was a Clinton era law called the, what was it? The Religious Restoration. It's called RFRA, Religious Foundation Restoration Act, or something like that. And it was sort of the first time that this law had been used to basically support people's private religious beliefs in a way that would affect kind of how they ran their company. And since then, especially with this kind of right-wing tilt to the Supreme Court, that model, that template has been used over and over again in other cases to kind of push this other agenda. And it's mostly been done through this organization that the Greens had a huge part in funding called the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF. And this is a legal group that was sort of founded by these religious figures, James Dobson, among others, to really use the courts as this way that they were going to get their foothold and sort of change America to be more in keeping with biblical law, or what they saw as biblical law. And so any kind of like right-wing religious controversy that you've seen over the last few years has mostly been supported by ADF. They've been behind a lot of the push against trans folks. They've been push against birth control and abortion. They were the ones that brought the case that then became Dobbs and overturned Roe v. Wade. So both in the kind of creating that template to use, Hobby Lobby was the kind of the first test case, and then the Green family has been funding this group, this ADF, that has essentially pushed this agenda and changed a lot of the laws of our country.
Yeah, it's so scary. It's just like this. It's just the things that happen that we don't even know are happening are just so strange all the time.
And that's the thing, is like people might have known about Hobby Lobby from the birth control case, but that's what I uncovered in my reporting, is just how they have been over the 10 years or 12 years since the birth control case. They've continued to be active in this area. You'd never know that because they never get up publicly and talk about abortion or LGBTQ rights or anything like that. But behind the scenes, they've just been funneling this money that's been, really affecting how those laws are interpreted.
Yeah. Do you think that they're not being as public about it so that they don't lose business?
I think so. I think, what I find really fascinating about this family is that they really present themselves as good people. And part of presenting themselves that way is presenting this kinder and gentler version of Jesus and of Christianity that really presents it as something that you want to be a part of. These Super Bowl ads, these He Gets Us ads that you see in the Super Bowl, where it's like Jesus and they're washing feet or they're, helping push a car out of the snow or something like that. And it's like, Jesus, He gets us, all of us.
Yeah, yes.
Those are from the Green family. Those are all funded to the tune of millions of dollars from the Greens. And so, on the one hand, I think they really do believe that, they love people and they care about people and they want people to be saved. And on the other hand, they're funding these groups that are really, to my mind, really hurting people and really causing a lot of stress and chaos and pain to people. And so I think, it's a real sort of interesting kind of dichotomy and I'm not even sure they're aware of it or they kind of reconciled in their own minds.
Well, and I guess it's the I'm going to treat individuals with kindness and respect, but then I'm going to make sure that the people that those individuals are, are suppressed on a mass scale. And then it doesn't feel like you're hurting the individual. It still feels like you're loving.
That's exactly right.
You hate the sin and you're loving the sinner. And as we know, that kind of, you can't really do that. I don't think that really squares.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
There's another story I tell in the book about David Green's other son, Mark Green, had this sort of brief foray into being a filmmaker. And he made this film about these Christian missionaries in Ecuador who, lost their lives, in being attacked by these tribespeople. And the main missionary in the film, turned out the actor who played him was gay.
Ooh, fun.
And it became this huge controversy in evangelical circles. But the Greens sort of defended it and said, well, this was God's purpose. And God wanted us to have him as the actor in order to bring him closer to God. And I ended up speaking with the actor who's no longer in the acting business anymore. And he said that, working on that film was like hell on earth for him because it was like a great role. And he was really excited to do it. But every 2 seconds, somebody was pulling him aside and trying to get him to, accept Jesus as his personal savior and, praying away the gay. And, it ended up like really doing a number on him that he had to, really recover from for years afterwards. And that in a microcosm for me was just like the story of this family, that they're sort of seeing this, what's in their mind is this good by, adhering to the rules of the Bible, and yet not even aware of sort of how they're tormenting this individual based on their, their own truly held beliefs.
Right.
And, that's kind of what I was really interested to explore as a journalist, that when you do have these fundamentalist beliefs, how do you approach people who don't think like you do? And, when you think they're wrong.
I guess there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess everyone's different, and they are taking just this, I think this way that it's like this easy way to reason each action individually, where you can just say, oh, well, this was God's plan over here, but like, it's not God's plan over here.
Right, exactly.
And I am deciding, like, it's not God's plan for this guy to be gay, but it is God's plan for this guy to not be gay soon. It's kind of like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think it's just, a really easy way to convince yourself of what you already want to do.
Yeah.
Which is, the American way.
I sort of toy with that idea in the book because, when they were acquiring all these biblical artifacts, they were very clear in saying that, God opened this door for us and wanted us to create this museum. And then when they had to give them all back because they were all looted and stolen, they didn't say anything about that being part of God's plan. They said we were led astray by these unscrupulous dealers that took advantage of us and stuff. They sort of blamed, these other people for their mistakes. And so on the one hand, when something happens right, it's God's plan. And when something happens wrong, it's somebody else's fault. And I think, there's a certain lack of maturity there and lack of accountability there that I thought was just fascinating to explore.
Perhaps we will blame the devil.
Right.
Another convenient scapegoat.
Satan is also there to accept the blame for sure.
More after this. And now back to the show. So we're talking about Christian nationalism. A big part of that, as we all know, is kind of this undercurrent of white supremacy, we can say. The who belongs in this nation, who doesn't. Have we seen anything from Hobby Lobby and that delves into immigration policy or other kinds of racial considerations, or are they staying out of that?
Well, they haven't delved into those areas specifically, but what was really interesting for me to see was how they have sort of behind the scenes funded a lot of the MAGA movement. Mm-hmm. And, there's this whole new strain within Christianity called the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR, that has grown up in the last few years. It has its roots in the same Pentecostalism that the Greens have their roots in. And they have fully embraced this sort of MAGA viewpoint, make America great again, America's a Christian nation. God has called upon us to, come back to our biblical roots. And the Greens have been, associated with a number of the figures of that movement. They provided space to them at the Museum of the Bible to, hold their conventions and prayer rallies. Mm-hmm. And then behind the scenes, they sort of started this group of wealthy Christians. It's got this funny name, Ziklag, which is some relation to like the city in the Bible where King David sort of, made his home or something. And they were really involved in the last election in purging voter rolls, in fostering anti-trans propaganda in key voting districts, and getting out the vote in churches. And so, again, they're not publicly standing up there, and, you'll never see one of the Greens sort of, stand up there and publicly advocate, except maybe a little bit on abortion and birth control. But behind the scenes, a lot of their money and a lot of their time and influence is going into these movements that are heavily associated with Project 2025 and MAGA and Trump and all of that. And, regardless of how Trump represents the, biblical ideals, which is a whole other topic.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, as we've talked about, it does feel like although they may be funding grifters, they are true believers themselves. Yeah. And part of your book talks about how kind of modestly they live. Because I think I'd expect mansions, and I'd expect, the typical kind of CEO of a mega corporation kind of lifestyle. But that's not what they really are about.
No. And, again, to their credit, it's now, a $4 billion company, and they could live with yachts and mansions if they wanted to. And there's certainly a history of that in evangelicalism. I mean, I go in a little bit about the history of some of these televangelists in the 80s and 90s who just
always fun.
Took a lot of their supporters and turned it into things like mansions and cars. But, that's what's so fascinating about this family is they live in a nice house in Oklahoma, but they don't have a private jet or a yacht or anything like that. Really, it's almost this obsession or fear about the afterlife and about living true to these tenets of God that really motivate them. And that I find absolutely fascinating, because if you do truly believe that this world is only a blip and, on the road to eternity, and you're going to be judged according to how you live according to these principles that were laid out in this instruction manual that God left behind, which is the Bible, then, it really does change the way that you act. And I think that that's really their motivation, is wake up every morning terrified about what the afterlife is going to look like and how can they stave that off, And I think that's what was really important to me in writing the book, was to sort of get across that viewpoint. Because it's one thing to say, here's these people that are doing these things that, you might think are terrible or really hurtful to people. But it's another to say, why are they doing it? And what really causes them to believe these things? And, it really ultimately comes back to this particular interpretation of the Bible that's just very compelling to a huge number of people in the United States.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll always be more apt to consider those things, and consider someone's life and who they are and what they believe, if they do believe it. Because as soon as I find out someone's a grifter, I want to learn everything about them and tell everyone about it, but there's nothing to grab onto in terms of can I connect with this on a human level?
Right.
We did one of the episodes I'd say I'm most proud of about the Westboro Baptist Church. And it was deep dive. I learned their whole theology. I learned everything I could about the history of their family. And it really left me with almost a similar impression of they do live in their personal lives by what they do believe, which you could disagree with or not that the Bible says, but they live it hard. And then they go out and they do what they think will save people, which is bully them essentially into, not going to hell. And they see that as loving because they're saying the truth.
Right.
And that is so much more interesting to me. This conversation is so much more interesting than just saying they're bigots, the end, and that's true. Don't get me wrong. That's absolutely true. And the harm they're doing is tremendous. But what is so interesting is that the things that they support end up supporting things that are biblically unsound, like the transfer of wealth to billionaires, more and more money going to the rich. That is fundamentally what they are supporting when they're supporting, the MAGA movement. Maybe they have either reconciled that because they're bringing in these biblical principles back into the mainstream. So they're well, it's okay if these guys are sinning in this pretty profound and direct way that Jesus talked about way more than homosexuality, which he actually never talked about. But, it's interesting that there's a way to convince yourself that as long as I am being nice, I can, turn around and support this movement that really goes in most ways against it, other than a surface way that is like supporting fascist power structures. It's kind of like, it's a wild thing to be able to convince yourself of.
But I think what's really fascinating about all of that is that it really kind of goes to this particular interpretation of the Bible, or many interpretations of the Bible that they adhere to. Mm-hmm. And when you read the Bible, I have a whole chapter about the Bible in my book because I just found it so fascinating that this book that has had so much influence on our culture, most people haven't read, or most people don't even know what's in it. And when you read it, it's a wild book. There's so much crazy stuff in there. I can't even begin to describe. You probably know.
I will tell you very quick. Our listeners know that I have been reading the Bible cover to cover, New International Version. I'm more than halfway done.
I did too.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And it's like, you think it's this one thing, and then you read it, and it's like, rape and polygamy and genocide.
It's a horror movie.
And, one thing after another. Mm-hmm. And the way that people have, when they say the Bible is this kind of true and accurate portrayal of history, what they're really saying is our own particular reading of it is a true and accurate portrayal. And it includes things like taking the 8 places in the Bible that they point to as referencing homosexuality or abortion, and their own particular spin on that, which is, controversial to say the least.
Yes.
And so that to me is what's even more fascinating. It's not like they're saying like, we believe the Bible and we're going to adhere to the Bible and we're true believers and this causes us to do, these things that cause harm to people. It's that we've been taught this particular interpretation of the Bible that's been reinforced through these fundamentalist channels as this kind of us versus them mentality. Yeah. We're right and they're wrong. And what are the natural consequences of that? And then when things come along like Donald Trump, who is the least sort of Christian figure that we had in our politics in terms of, how he lives his personal life, they're able to say, well, he's just an instrument of God's will. And he's like these biblical kings from the Bible that have been, used, these pagan kings from the Bible that have been used by God for his purposes. And they're able to justify it. So on the one hand, they're able to say, we're living these biblical principles. On the other hand, it's like, what are biblical principles? And that's, something that you could spend years trying to figure out.
And what defines living by them, right? Where it's like, that's a really interesting thing. Is like, okay, I in my little bubble am being nice to gay people, but it's in this bigger picture, it is like, I don't know. It's interesting that your own actions stop at what you almost like physically do, but like where your money goes or where your support goes, that doesn't count. Right. So it's a very interesting thought experiment. How do you reconcile these different things? And it really is just like, I want to believe this. I want to do this. So let's figure out how to get there in my own thinking. Yeah.
And even putting money in the hands of billionaires, there's a way in which these fundamentalists, this kind of strand in Christianity called Reconstructionism, has it has this real capitalist bent, and it really shows how Jesus really believed in compound interest, and they take it to that kind of absurd level that communists are evil and godless. Even though if you look at Jesus and the apostles, they were more communist than anything.
No kidding. And I guess reading the Old Testament, I can see more of a prosperity gospel vibe going on there, where you're like, okay, people are getting rich because they're being good Christians. But then, you have Jesus coming in being like, although the Old Testament is very much about the poor too. Here's one question.
Yeah. I'll see if I can answer it.
Has Hobby Lobby done anything for people who are in need of services?
Well, this is what is really interesting is generally no. The answer to your question is mostly no. And they have done some. But in comparison to the vast amounts of, hundreds of millions of dollars that they have devoted towards these biblical causes of getting the Bible in the hands of the most people, the amount of money they spend on homeless shelters or, disadvantaged youth or things like that, it's a pittance. And it always sort of comes with these strings attached. And Barbara Green, David's wife, was for a while on the board of this a series of shelters in Oklahoma City. And, even as she was sort of putting her money towards them, they were giving reports about how many souls that they'd saved from the homeless people who were coming into the shelters. So that's always the goal, no matter what the needs are to get there. They may be kind of easing people's physical burdens along the way, but it's always with an aim to get them closer to accepting Jesus as their savior and, getting to the afterlife.
Yeah, and I guess that's just kind of how fundamentalism operates.
Yeah, and they're very
It
explicit about
operates
it.
more on saving souls and
Yeah.
not on good works, whatever you want to call good works. But I mean, I'm not terribly surprised by that answer.
Yeah.
Are there any other stories you feel like you would like to tell on our show before we kind of do some final thoughts?
The only thing that we haven't really talked about is the kind of nationalism of the whole thing behind Christian nationalism. And,
Yeah.
Alongside the promotion of the Bible that the Greens have done, they have also been big supporters of this idea of America being founded as a Christian nation.
Okay.
This is a huge part of what is really motivating evangelicals today, is this kind of reinterpreting, if not rewriting, the history of the early days of our country and finding this quote unquote evidence of how all the founding fathers were, really evangelicals, and how the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were really biblically inspired documents. And, so much of that has been debunked. And, I went back and forth in the scholarship, but there is this one evangelical Christian historian by the name of David Barton who has been huge in promoting this. And the Greens, again, have supported him both financially and giving him a platform in terms of putting him in their ads that they put in newspapers on the 4th of July. Mm-hmm. And he has become really powerful in particularly Republican circles, where he was on the Republican committee in Texas, and then nationally has become advisor to presidents. And Mike Johnson in Congress says that David Barton was a mentor of his. And, when Johnson became speaker, he, gave the speech at the Museum of the Bible, how he was Moses and going to be leading, America to the promised land. And so, again, it's never overt, but you can draw this direct connection to, the support that this family has provided to a figure like David Barton, given him legitimacy, given him a platform. And then he goes on and influences our politics in ways that 30% of people in our country believe that, the founding fathers were evangelical Christians and America was founded as a Christian nation, even though, the evidence is very sparse to support that. So, it really kind of shows you the influence that people can have.
Yeah. And that just desire, again, that we've been talking about, to figure out a way to just be right and sure in your own beliefs, because you're scared you're going to hell. It's really like you can figure it out, right? You can figure out the peace. I'm so glad I don't believe in hell. I hope you don't believe in hell, Michael.
I don't.
It really makes things easier in a lot of ways.
I have to say, I came into the book as sort of a religious skeptic, and I think in my research and learning more about how the Bible is written, I've become more skeptical than ever. So it's sort of,
me too.
Even as I've understood sort of how, this family and others like them have become these believers in these scriptures. And I try to present that, in a way that is genuine. But I think for me, it just became more and more apparent to me that a lot of the stuff has just been culturally constructed through the centuries. And I don't know what happens after we die, but I don't think it's exactly how that describes it.
Good. Yeah. And I mean, what it really teaches you is how psychology works.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think you can apply this to political beliefs. You can apply it to so much. Yeah. So I think that that's a very important part of the work that you're doing, as well as, including exposing this family. Yeah. But understanding, to me, is so much more important than I think weight is put on, right? I think it is really valuable. And so I will ask you now at the end here, you finished the book, it's coming out.
Yes.
What do you feel like you have learned about maybe this political moment, or how you think we could move forward in a different way? I know that's a big question, but, what are you left with that you would like to impress upon other people?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I don't have an answer for how we can move forward from this political moment. Unfortunately, I wish I did.
I wish you did too.
That what I hope that I'm providing as part of the conversation is this better explanation for why people believe what they do and how that's influenced our culture and our politics. Because, it would have been easy to write sort of a screed against this family and this company and, talk about how bad they are. And I really tried very hard not to do that, and to use their own words as much as possible, to really try to get in their heads as much as I could, and really to describe their belief system. I think, as a journalist, that's something that I want to provide to my readers, is more of an explanation. So maybe the next time, they have a conversation with their uncle at Thanksgiving, or maybe, in a wider context when they're, engaged in a political debate, they maybe understand where the other side's coming from a little bit more, and whether they agree with it or not, they can maybe speak to it in a more strategic way. So
yeah.
I guess that's sort of what I can provide and what I hope I have provided in the book.
Yeah.
But as far as, a wider answer to the polarization in our country, I don't know.
No, I mean, that's, I think, a large part of what our show is also trying to do at any given time is provide people this inroad to understand the people in their lives who maybe they seem like they can't understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I think it's what we do.
Yeah.
Whether it helps, I hope it does.
I'm sure it does.
But I think that one thing we can agree on, Michael, is that we should let our listeners know that they should shop at their independent local craft store.
I will leave that up to them after they've read the book to determine how they feel about that.
Mm-hmm. We'll all encourage it.
I certainly would not blame them if they decided at the end to do that. Let me put it that way.
I can tell them what to do. Okay. Well, Michael, this has been so interesting. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. No, it's been a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
This was American Hysteria. Make sure you pick up a copy of Michael's book, The Gospel According to Hobby Lobby. Link in our episode notes. If you love American Hysteria and want to support our show and help make sure that we can continue to create it, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get ad-free episodes as well as bonus content, including Hysteria Home Companion, the other podcast that I do with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we cover and stories that we just know that you'll love. We have a huge back catalog, so if you're looking for more episodes of American Hysteria, that is the best place that you can go. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you go to our website, AmericanHysteria.com, you can pick up some of our merch. 100% of those profits go to the Samir Project, a Palestinian-led mutual aid group in Gaza. You can also leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or one you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. If you're feeling generous, another great way to help out our show is to leave us a 5-star review on whatever app you use. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius-Smith. This episode has additional editing by AJ McKinley, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great week.